Well, hello and welcome back. This is segment 5 of a podcast series that we're calling America Under Fire, The Old Guy Speaks. We've had 3 podcast segments that have dealt with the U.S. dollar. Let's talk now about some of the Marxist depopulation ideas. The Marxist set apparently believes there are way too many of us here on Mother Earth, and it appears that they also feel we own too many things that could best be owned and managed by a small but enlightened cadre of elites, for our benefit, of course. In any event, depopulation is a major part of their envisioned Brave New World. And our elite World Economic Forum types have been working hard on solutions to that bogus problem. I'd like to touch on 2 depopulation projects: climate change and pandemics. Climate change is one of the more persistent Marxist ploys that has had a high profile for at least 40 years. It's a narrative that predicts a climate apocalypse brought on by the burning of fossil fuels, primarily coal, oil, and natural gas, producing emissions of carbon dioxide, CO2, that they assert will cause broadly spread acute environmental damages. Climate change disciples are similar to those of the other Marxist narratives in that they won't discuss or debate the facts, but rather seek to simply cancel, i.e., shout down or destroy, anyone with a contrary viewpoint. They declare that the science is settled. They support what they call a net zero carbon economy by 2050, meaning no fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, no fossil fuels being used. It's a pipe dream for several reasons. Here's one. I just read an interview with a Mr. Rick Rule, R-U-L-E, a recognized leader in natural resource industries for decades now. It seems that over the last 40 years, we have spent well in excess of $5 trillion, trillion with a T, $5 trillion on alternative energies like wind and solar. In that time, we have reduced the market share of fossil fuels from a high of 82% 40 years ago to a low of 81% today. Yes, you heard that right. 82% down to 81%, $5 trillion. Let's look at 2 subsets of the climate change narrative: electric vehicles and food scarcity. One subset of the climate change narrative is a proposed switch to electric vehicles, which require enormous amounts of fossil-fueled power to mine the required minerals like lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, and so on. Something like 500 tons of overburden or matrix material must be moved or processed to produce a ton of lithium, with a whole lot of CO2 released in the process, plus other mining environmental damages. EVs cost so much, electric vehicles cost so much, that dealerships are already wondering how to sell them. And my favorite EV illustration is about the governor of California many months ago actively promoting electric vehicles, EVs, while his own electric grid officials are asking Californians not to charge their EVs at that time because the electric grid couldn't currently satisfy even the demands of existing EVs. You get that? Currently satisfy? Squib, regarding lithium batteries. Here's some information from the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. 1. The lithium needed for just the U.S., Europe, and China, no Africa, no South America, no Australia, no emerging economies, just U.S., China, and Europe. Lithium needed 311.5 million tons for powering cars, trucks, buses, and motorcycles, and another 32.6 million tons for powering railroad locomotives. Just as a side thing here, each locomotive battery would weigh 310.5 tons and would run the train for 14.4 hours. That totals 344 million tons of lithium just for land transportation in those three areas, not for industry and not for sea and air mobility or transportation. 344 million tons. But the article said that estimated global reserves of lithium are 22 million tons, and total global production of lithium in 2021 was only 100,000 tons, 1/10 of a million. You see a bit of a disconnect there. Number 2, you need to process 500 tons of material to recover 1 ton of lithium. That would be 172 billion tons of material needing processed for just land transportation in those three entities. You better pick up some oil company stocks. That's a lot of material that's going to be moved. Once again, the source for this is the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C., their July-August 2023 report. They reported on a study by the Geological Survey of the nation of Finland. Okay, how about some more insanity? Also from the Capital Research article, and looking beyond just electric vehicles. For the U.S. alone to transition away from fossil fuels by 2050, we would need to complete building the following: 47 solar farms, 54 wind farms, 1 nuclear power plant, 3 hydroelectric dams, and 20 geothermal, tidal, or bio-waste plants per month until the year 2050. Per month. 47 solar farms per month, 54 wind farms per month, and so on, until 2050. And that assumes that the climate disciples would allow nuclear and hydroelectric, which they may not. It just seems like pure insanity to me. Going back to electric vehicles, there are other articles out there that deal with the huge federal and other subsidies, meaning especially subsidies by electric rate payers. Subsidies needed just to get EVs out the showroom door at prices that are still much higher than ICE vehicles. What's an ICE vehicle? ICE, internal combustion engine, standard type of vehicle that we have now. And EVs reportedly don't even lower emissions when you include all costs, including that mining and so on. Factor in the electricity needed to mine the lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, and so on for the batteries. And my personal sense is that we'd have a pretty large net negative, both financially and environmentally. Okay, as just an aside before we move on, there appears to be a dawning recognition that nuclear energy can safely and dependably provide the baseload power we'll need in the future. In fact, the billionaires who are building the huge AI data centers that will need equally huge amounts of dependable energy, are reportedly looking seriously at building their own nuclear power plants for their data centers. And several other companies are gearing up to produce what are called small modular reactors, SMRs. These are nuclear reactors that can be safely built, safely delivered via flatbed truck, and then safely power many thousands of households in a more decentralized and environmentally friendly grid. And that's all very hopeful. Let me move now to our other subtopic under climate change, which is food scarcity. The Marxists have targeted food production, and it goes far beyond asserting that cows make too much methane so we can't have beef or dairy, or the proposed substitution of lab-grown fake meats and insect proteins for actual meats. The U.S. government now proposes to place 30% of America's lands into conservation uses by the year 2030, meaning, I believe, primarily lands taken out of food production uses. Marxist private entities are buying huge swaths of farmland for very murky reasons. And Congress just passed legislation to fund RFID ear tags for cows and bison, which will enable tracking and restrictions on meat and dairy supplies. Dismantling farming and food production globally is also a primary goal of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset. Food is also a good example of the destructive power of the administrative deep state here in the U.S. Newsletter editor Lee Bellinger advises that draconian new Department of Agriculture directives now require the mass slaughter of chickens and other livestock if even a single animal is infected. And it's all being done without regard to herd immunity. His May 2023 article said that 60 million farm birds had been slaughtered in a year's time. These mass extermination protocols run counter to the most fundamental principles of animal husbandry and breeding. Bellinger mentions two prominent scientists, Jerry Coyne and Anna Krylov, who have picked up on a shift in the related science from merit to ideology, saying, quote, "Science that does not prioritize merit doesn't work, and substituting dogma for quality is a shortcut to disaster," unquote. They cite the reincarnation of a mid-20th century Marxist ideology called Lysenkoism, which produced 7 decades of food shortages in Russia and China. Lysenkoism was a political campaign led by Soviet biologist Trofim Lysenko against genetics and science-based agriculture. More than 3,000 mainstream biologists were dismissed or imprisoned, and numerous scientists were executed in the Soviet campaign to suppress scientific opponents. And all this led to infamous Russian and Chinese famines that killed millions of people. Lysenkoism rejected standard farming practices going back over a millennium. In its modern Marxist revival, Coyne and Krylov have warned, quote, "This new species of Lysenkoism is more pernicious than the old because it affects all science, chemistry, physics, sciences, medicine, and math, not merely biology and agriculture. The new Lysenkoism is just one more example of what happens when truth dies." Europe is a little ahead of us in the deliberate destruction of farming, which their governments say they're doing to comply with, quote, the Paris Climate Agreement or Accords, unquote. And you've seen the farmers demonstrating there against increasingly insane demands or restrictions being placed on them. U.S. farmers are coming under these same pressures. We need to help our farmers by pushing our politicians to help our farmers, by determining specifically what it is about the Paris Climate Accords that apparently threatens to produce famine on a global basis. Planning for famine would be a crime against humanity. And that's all I have on food scarcity. Back to climate change generally. Climate change is an ingenious narrative. It instills fear in people. It's squishy enough to pull off unless good people start speaking up. And it can be a major force in moving America into a brutal totalitarianism. In addition to producing a generalized fear via the false narrative itself, climate change instills a particular fear in academia, in that any researchers seeking funds for climate-related research had better come to conclusions supporting the false narrative, or they may be ostracized, frozen out of future grants, or suffer career-limiting or career-destroying consequences. This actually applies to Marxist narratives throughout science, business, finance, the social arena, everything I'm discussing. Dissent brings negative consequences, but not all is lost. In August of 2023, more than 1,600 scientists, including 2 Nobel laureates, who affiliated under the organizational name of the Climate Change Intelligence Group, acronym CLINTEL, C-L-I-N-T-E-L, the Global Climate Intelligence Group, signed a declaration stating that there is no climate emergency and that climate advocacy has devolved into mass hysteria. One of the Nobel laureates, Dr. John F. Clauser, winner of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics, has said the following, and this is a quotation, quote, "Misguided climate science has metastasized into massive shock journalistic pseudoscience. In turn, the pseudoscience has become a scapegoat for a variety of other unrelated ills. It has been promoted and extended by similarly misguided business marketing agents, politicians, journalists, government agencies, and environmentalists," close quote. And here are some quotes from 2 prominent climate scientists who more recently demolished the government's case for releasing some proposed EPA climate change regulations. One of them stated that, quote, "Science has never been made by consensus. The way you decide something is true in science is you compare it with experiment or observations." The other scientist declared, "In science, consensus is irrelevant. What are relevant are reproducible results." Now again, please understand that not all is darkness, and that hope does endure for us, and that we will discuss that later. Squibb, AP, Associated Press, bragged about getting $8 million from philanthropists to hire over 20 journalists, specifically to cover climate issues. I wonder who those philanthropists were. Squibb. Here are 2 wonderful U.S. entities who are working to shine light on the global climate alarm scam. First is the CO2 Coalition in Arlington, Virginia, and secondly, an organization called CFACT, C-F-A-C-T, Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, and their headquarters is in Washington, D.C. And let me recommend to you now two really excellent books on climate change. I would recommend to you this book, Inconvenient Facts. This is written by a man named Gregory Whitestone, who is the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. Inconvenient Facts is kind of a play on Al Gore's book, Inconvenient Truths. And so we have Inconvenient Truth many years ago. Now we have Inconvenient Facts. Second book, also by Gregory Whitestone of the CO2 Coalition, is called A Very Convenient Warming. Read this one, and you will be very grateful to hear from this man. I found both of these on Amazon by looking for them specifically. You may need to shop for them by name, as they may or may not be headlined in any bookseller advertising, but I did get both from Amazon. Let me give another plug, if I might, for the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. They do honest research on many fronts, and they're an excellent source of information. Let me give you a couple, kind of a big squib, maybe some mini squibs here, just some things to shout out at you. A marine cloud brightening program led by University of Washington researchers is conducting a solar radiation modification cloud seeding experiment in the San Francisco Bay Area to try to increase cloud cover and lower Earth temperatures. NASA proposes flying plane loads of ice to 58,000 feet and spraying fine ice particles as ice nuclei to promote cloud formation. The University of Hawaii proposes giant parasols as, quote, tethered solar shields, unquote, to shade and cool the earth. And a company called Make Sunsets is reportedly already creating high-altitude clouds by releasing balloons full of sulfur dioxide. See this second book of Gregory Whitestone, Very Convenient Warming, to understand how civilization has regressed when the earth cools even slightly, so that you may understand the very dangerous implications of these earth cooling researchers of what they're doing. So thank you very much. That completes our thoughts on climate change. We're going to take a break now. Thank you for watching.